Ya, selamat pagi semuanya. Good morning. Semangat. Last day. Yeah, and then we have like our very special keynote speaker here. Brad, are you there? Can you wave? Hello. Okay. Let me first introduce our keynote speakers today. Dr. Bradley McDonnell is an associate professor in the Department of Linguistics at University of Hawaii at Manoa. He is also an affiliate faculty in the same university in the Center of the Southeast Asian Studies. And Dr. McDonnell has been dedicating most of his career in documenting and describing languages in Indonesia, particularly in Sumatra, such as Bersama, ya, bahasa Bersama, bahasa Nasal, and he draws on methodologies from documentary linguistics, juga mengerjakan corpus linguistic and data science. And the majority of these projects are built upon collaboration with language communities in Indonesia and usually involve collaboration. Jadi Dr. Bradley McDonnell sudah sering melakukan community building di Indonesia melalui berbagai macam language documentation training, baik terhadap penutur maupun memberikan training kepada para akademisi di contohnya di Universitas Indonesia, UPI, dan di Atmajaya. If I have to read your publication, that will take more than 45 minutes, but he has multiple publications, yeah, including the most cited one by Bradley McDonnell, co-authored with Chen and Victoria Chan, published in Annual Review of Linguistics, paper titled Western Austronesia. Western Austronesian voice, sorry. His talks today examines the documentation of multilingual practices in nasal speech community alongside recent efforts to develop materials for nasal language maintenance. In particular, he will explore the tensions that arise from concerted efforts to document the multilingual speech practices on the one hand, and efforts to maintain the ancestral code nasal on the other. Ya. Dan ngomong-ngomong ini former advisor saya dulu ya, yang membantu disertasi saya di Sasak. Anyway, your time is yours. Alright, silakan Pak.
Terima kasih banyak, Nisa. Thank you very much, Nisa, for that introduction. Very happy to be here today. Let me go ahead and share my slides. So let me try that. Okay. Can everyone see? I guess I'll ask Nisa. Nisa, can you see my slides? Are they being shown here?
Ya, sudah.
Sudah?
We can see your slides.
Okay. Okay, so selamat pagi, everyone. Again, thank you for coming to this talk. I hope that you've had a great conference. I'm quite humbled to be following such a great list of keynote speakers, and so I know my talk won't live up to theirs, but I hope you get something out of it. So today I'm going to talk about documenting multilingualism, but maintaining the ancestral code. And so I'll explain a little bit later what I mean by ancestral code. I think it should become clear in my talk today that this presentation actually, even though it has my name on it and I put together the slides, that it actually represents the work of many different people. Um, and so, I mentioned their names throughout, but I want to mention it from the beginning here that this is all very much collaborative efforts, both with the Nassau community and with others in Indonesia, as well as at with Ph.D. students at my university in Hawaii. Okay, so multilingualism, or what we may say as multilectalism, so just many different dialects being spoken in the same community in Indonesia, is virtually ubiquitous. I think it would be hard to find a community that uh, is not multilingual or not multilectal in Indonesia. And so it's obviously a big concern for anybody who is living or working in Indonesia. And emerging patterns of multilingualism in some contexts are leading to language shift on the one hand, where there's a change in the number of languages that are being spoken. Um, and but there are also other reported cases where there are shifting patterns of multilingualism as well. So in the language shift scenario, we would see that the number of languages is decreasing, where they're an endangered language is not being spoken, whereas in a shifting pattern of multilingualism, we might observe just a change in which languages are spoken. And this pattern of multilingualism, while we might want to think about it being new as Indonesia has developed over the past 100 years, it's actually not new. I don't think. And there's evidence all throughout with language contact among the speech communities in Indonesia as well. So I think that this multilingualism is actually quite old, although we are seeing different patterns emerging in Indonesia. And in these multilingual speech communities involving what I'll call a local language, this could be called also a minoritized language or a non-dominant language or an indigenous language. But I'll use the word local language, what you might translate as bahasa daerah. It's often that this local language is at risk or endangered. And so it makes sense that these local languages are often the target of our documentation, as well as our maintenance and revitalization efforts. And so I know that many of the keynote speakers and many of you have been talking about this already at this conference. And so the flip side of that coin is that the documentation and maintenance or revitalization efforts often occur in multilingual communities. And so it's something that I think pretty much any documentary linguist or anybody interested in language maintenance or revitalization needs to be aware of these issues. And this isn't true just in Indonesia, but true in pretty much all over the world, that this is the case. So in the language documentation literature, as it's developed I would say since the mid 1990s, late 1990s, there's been a recognition of the prevalence of multilingualism in these communities that speak an endangered language. And so we've seen a shift in the way that the documentary linguists or language documenters are discussing this. And there's been a shift from discussing the practice of documenting a language, a single language, to documenting the linguistic practices of a speech community. So instead of me documenting Nasal or documenting Busama, I would actually be documenting the linguistic practices of the Nasal community or of the Busama community. And when it comes to revitalizing or maintaining languages, revitalization and language maintenance efforts have long recognized the actual need for multilingualism. So there are very few discussions in language revitalization of decreasing the number of languages that somebody would speak or replacing the language that somebody would speak, but usually it's in addition to or maintaining some sort of multilingual situation. So it's normally the case that in addition to a local language, that somebody is encouraged to continue to speak Indonesian, but it would be alongside the local language. They wouldn't, we encourage people not to give up their local language in order to speak Indonesian. And so the introduction of revitalization and these maintenance efforts often transforms, but I should say that the introduction of revitalization or maintenance effort, this often transforms the ways in which members of the community discuss language use and view themselves and others in relation to it. So often when we start to have revitalization efforts, there is a new way of discussing these sorts of issues. So all of this background kind of brings me to the goals of this talk. So drawing on previous models of documenting multilingualism, in this talk, I plan to demonstrate the advantages and some of the complexities of documenting the multilingual speech practices of what I think is a pretty unique community in Southwest Sumatra, the Nasal community. And then based on very recent experiences in developing materials for language maintenance, I will want to discuss how these efforts to maintain the language have centered on approaches that favor a kind of a pure form of the local language, or something that would be called asli or something like that. And so we'll first kind of talk about some of the evolving approaches to language documentation. And then I'll discuss the Nasal speech community, the multilingual contexts, and documenting the multilingual speech practices, as well as these burgeoning efforts for developing language maintenance and developing these materials. And then discuss a little bit about the tensions between multilingual documentation and ancestral code approaches to language maintenance before concluding. So let's talk about the evolving approaches to language documentation. And before we do that, I really want to introduce you to a term that was first coined by Tony Woodbury in 2005, and then he discusses it in more depth in 2011, and that's this term ancestral code. And by ancestral code, he's talking about the language so this is typically the endangered language on which the documentation project is focused. So this is if we're focusing on a particular language, this is the sort of code that we're focusing on. And it's usually the idealized pure form, or the form that kind of has some sort of nostalgia associated with it. It's the form that's not mixed. It doesn't have any borrowings in it. It's the kind of pure form of the language. So it's something that's very idealized. And really, you can only understand the ancestral code in contrast to how it's in the flip side of how it's been characterized, which Austin 2016 says, in contrast, it's the contrast to this is dynamic language practices and their real life interactions in their sociolinguistic contexts. So this is where we see code switching, code mixing, borrowings, and different words being used in real-time communication between speakers in a speech community where maybe multiple languages are being used. So what we've seen is that early on in the document, in language documentation, and even kind of prior to the documentary language documentation turn in the 1990s, is we saw a more ancestral code approach, and we'll return to that in a little bit. But there's been a second approach that many have kind of advocated for, and this would be the approach that would say, let's document what's really going on, what's really happening, what people are really doing when they're communicating with each other. So this is a shift towards documenting actual language practices. And so this is the documentation of multilingual practices, of people switching languages or using different languages with different people, or different languages in different contexts. Maybe the different languages they might use at a wedding ceremony versus the languages that they would use at home. Attention is given in these cases to different sociolinguistic contexts. So not just recording in one particular context, but in multiple contexts. There's an emphasis in this sort of approach on natural conversation, and there's a greater focus on language ecology. So I'll present two kind of approaches to this. One of them is by Jeff Good, who takes an approach where he talks about documenting the linguistic repertoires of different speakers. So instead of documenting a speech event, as most of us might do, or as many have done in the past, he advocates that we look at the linguistic behavior and knowledge of individuals, and we look at how they behave in different environments, and use languages across time and social settings within the community that they're a part of. And so in this approach, there's a greater focus on an individual or a set of individuals, and so you can see from this sort of approach that we would be limiting the number of people who would be a part of a documentation project, but we would be gaining different insights in that we wouldn't just have one individual in one social context, but we would have an individual in multiple contexts. And we could, he also advocates in the same way that we would link, because we're focusing on individuals, that we would link these individuals to things like ethnographic interviews or sociolinguistic surveys to the documentation of the different events. And so this is the documentation of linguistic repertoires. Now, Pier Paolo Di Carlo has another way of looking at this. And so he kind of sets up two different extreme approaches. So he sets up the ancestral code approach and so he discusses the ancestral code approach, which is what we've kind of looked at, and contrasts this with the phenomenological approach. And so the ancestral code approach is the one that filters out a single language in the interest of producing the Boasian trilogy or a grammar, dictionary, and the like. It describes the lexical grammatical code. And so that would be, it describes the grammar of the language, the morphosyntax, but maybe not the other sort of aspects of the language. And it can be quite reductionist as well, in that it's only focusing on this single language. While the phenomenological approach focuses on observed communicative practices in the community. In this sort of approach, the researcher does not develop an a priori sort of plan to document the language, but this sort of model promotes the observation of linguistic practices as they surface in naturally occurring communicative events. So you can see that these sorts of approaches are laid out in kind of opposition to one another. So these models have several advantages that both Di Carlo and Good provide. But there are several challenges when you try to implement these sorts of models. Some of these are practical. For example, it's not always easy to document a single person in many different settings, for example. So in certain public settings, it can be quite difficult to document a particular person. With Di Carlo's approach, there's also this idea of not having planned almost anything and going and observing, which if you are under time constraints at all, can actually be quite difficult to implement practically as well. But I think there are many good elements that we were able to implement in the Nassau project, which we will talk about in the next session. So let's take a look at the Nassau speech community. So the Nassau speech community is spoken by about 3,000 people in southern Bengkulu province, in about 4 villages. And it wasn't known to linguists until about 2007, when somebody had kind of uncovered a word list and said, this doesn't quite look like any of the languages around it, even though there's a large number of borrowings. And so Nassau in this way really flies under the radar. And you see this even to this day. The entire province is called Nassau, And when you refer to something as Bahasa Nasal or Baso Nasal or something like that, people usually think of the local Malay, which is also called Kawur, as Bahasa Nasal, being the language of the Nasal province. And so this is a member of the Sumatran subgroup, and apologies for the my citations didn't come through here, but this is from Smith 2017, and then a paper that that my students and I wrote that came out last year. And this proposes that Nasal is actually related to the Batak languages, Gayo, and then all of the languages of the Barrier Islands. And Nasal actually represents a complex multilingual situation. So the current multilingual situation in Nassau is that Nassau speakers are universally multilingual, and we'll return to this in a little bit. So they at least speak Kawar, which is a local Malay that's spoken about 40,000 people in this region. It's not understandable by Indonesian speakers. It's quite a different variety of Malay. But all, as far as we have seen, all Nassau speakers also speak Kawar. There's also, they also speak, many people also speak South Barisan Malay, as there are sizable communities of Semende and Besema people in this region. And so many people are also quite fluent in then a variety of South Barisan Malay, as well as what some people would call Baso Bengkulu, as well as Indonesian. This is an asymmetrical multilingualism, which we'll return to. So while there's current multilingualism occurring in the Nassau speech community, there's also historical language contact. And there's really three layers of influence in the Nassau community. There's first kind of this, as my diagram has here, this kind of core Nassau element. So there's elements in the Nassau that we can really identify as being clearly Nassau, and then there's earlier Lampungic elements as well, and with that were borrowed at an earlier time. And then there are more recent Malay borrowings. Excuse me. There's a so this shows a long history of contact in the region. And a complex patterns of borrowings and adaptations, which I would love to share with you, but I'll share just a little bit today at the lexicon, in the lexicon, in morphology, and in the syntax as well. So if we start to kind of peel back these layers, first, based essentially on different sound changes that we can identify in Nassau, there are words that are distinctly Nassau that are not borrowed from Lampungic languages or Malayic languages, and this is how we know it's not related directly to Lampungic or Malayic. And so there's more words in this, but I just have included a couple of examples like Wayil or Khala for water and blood. There's also some evidence of morphology that is found in Nassau, and apparently not borrowed from Lampungic or Malay, which is this intransitive infix. This infix is found in many Malayo-Polynesian, Austronesian languages, but is is not found in the same sorts of uses in Lampungic or Malayic. But there's also many borrowings from Lampungic, words like bihum and kikoi. So bihum meaning cheek and kikoi meaning scratch. And there's even, some prefixes like me, which is used with kinship words that are also borrowed from Lampungic. In Malayic and with Malayic languages, there's also we also see borrowings that are distinctly borrowings from Kawar and not necessarily borrowed from other varieties of Malay. And this would make sense, being that that Nasal is in most contact with Kawar, and speakers are universally bilingual in it. And so when we peel back these layers, we see that there's still at present we see lots of variation in the use of different forms. So, for example, with the relative clause markers, you'll see variation in the form of the relative clause as being sai, which is an older form of the relativizer, but speakers will also use yang quite a bit. And so this reflects the current practices of multilingualism, where there's clear patterns of variation, especially among younger speakers. There's also a lot of loan content words that show that the contact between Kawar and Nasal is not necessarily new contact, but is relatively old. And even other function words like prepositions and some pronouns that are coming from Malayic languages that represent a newer sort of contact. With the Lampungic languages, we see a sort of different pattern because we see invariant loan lexicon. So this is from a historic contact that we actually don't witness today. So we don't see the multilingualism today, but we see a large number of apparent loans from Lampungic languages. These are content words. We see part of the functional systems that have come about as a part of sustained multilingualism, as well as other lexical borrowings. And so what we witness in Nassau is that we've got these multiple layers where at one point in the history, it must have been the case that they were that Nassau speakers were multilingual in Lampungic languages, and now we're seeing much more multilingualism in Malayic languages. And so this leads us to the point where to be Nassau is to be multilingual. And this is something we would commonly hear in there as well. It's part of the fabric of the community, and it critically must be reflected in the documentation. So moving on to the documentation of the multilingual speech practices of the community. First, we have a collaborative documentation project. Documentation projects that are going to focus on this, take a kind of multilingual sort of approach, are going to, by necessity, really necessitate collaboration. And this involves this involves collaboration as well as training and capacity building. And this involves quite a number of people from both Atmajaya, Manoa, and BRIN. And so here are just some pictures of them, and I'll mention some of these people at the end of the presentation. And this involves training and language documentation techniques for Nassau community members, as well as building capacity for them to be able to have laptops and recorders and things like that to document their language. So when we're documenting the multilingual speech practices, we developed a corpus, and our focus was on natural conversation. We found that that was an area where most people would be using the languages uh, that they speak every day, and that's where we found a lot of multilingual sorts of activity happening. And so in these sorts of settings, we found lots of code switching between Nassau, Sumende, and Kawar. And we focused on using people's social networks and their own relationships to record them in these sorts of contexts. We also did interviews on language use. So many of you probably recognize Dendi here, and Dendi is probably there, where we interviewed 28 people in the Nassau community. So this is following kind of Jeff Good's sort of approach to understand how people are using the language. And there are different patterns of language use, language attitudes. And so we looked at a wide range of people, and these are also people who participated in many of the recordings as well. And these interviews really confirmed a lot of the sorts of things that we were finding, which is to speak Nassau, Nassau speakers also speak Kawar, and many of whom also speak Semende. We see that that there were overall generally positive attitudes towards Nassau and Kawar and Indonesian, with some mixed feelings about Semende. And we found that things like domains of language use were actually quite unhelpful. It mostly depended on who they were talking to.
Sorry, Brett, 6 more minutes.
So moving on to the more recent language maintenance efforts that we've seen for Nassau. At the outset of this project, there really was no one working on the documentation, description, or any other aspects of this project. No one locally in the community or elsewhere. There was
4 minutes. Can you hear me? I'm sorry.
there was moderate interest in developing a dictionary, but a little interest in other products. And it was most helpful to develop relationships with the community through the documentation project itself. So through the collaborations that we started, we've seen that as years have gone on, there's been more enthusiasm for materials development in certain cultural books, primers, dictionaries. And we've also seen that there's more of an emphasis on pure Nasal and a separation of the languages where we haven't done this in the documentation project itself. So some things that we've created is, as you can see in this picture below, a graduate student from UH created a nice counting book in Nassau. And then one of our Nassau community members who's working on the project, Johan Safri, is creating cultural books that explain certain Nassau ceremonies. And so these are things that he came up with himself as well. Blaine Billings, who's a Ph.D. student at UH, is developing a dictionary for his dissertation. And just last month, we held consultations with community members in determining how that dictionary is going to look. And we've seen a lot more interest in these sorts of materials being developed. So the ideologies surrounding this maintenance tend to focus on what is pure or true or original Nassau language, with more resistance to include things that are commonly viewed as borrowings, for example. And we also see instances where the development of the orthography, there was explicit mention as it needed to be distinct from Kawar and other Malay languages, whereas these sorts of discussions had never kind of occurred before during the documentation of Nassau, but are coming up as we're looking to in maintenance. So ideally, the documentation supports maintenance, but we now are seeing kind of a mismatch in what's being documented and the materials that are being created. And so this creates a sort of tension. And so if we actually return to kind of in conclusion here, if we return to Woodbury's notion of ancestral code, he points out that when we talk about the ancestral code, it can actually be useful at a community level to support things like orthography creation, the preparation of pedagogical dictionaries, grammars, and readers, and efforts to get the language taught in schools and or recognized politically. And these are exactly the sorts of issues that we are facing in Nassau and that we are worried about or that we're concerned with in language maintenance sorts of efforts. So to conclude, the relationship between documentation and maintenance and revitalization, I think, is more complex than is typically recognized. And I think we need more nuanced approaches that help us understand both the documentation and its relationship to maintenance, that also gives us some space to have different goals of each sort of practice. Thank you.
Thank you. Tepuk tangan dong. Did you hear the applause?
I did. Thank you.
Alright, great. Ya, Bapak Ibu yang di ruangan dulu, if you have any question or comment, ini menarik ya paparannya. Jadi ini pendekatan language documentation-nya menggunakan pendekatan multilingual, ya. Jadi tidak mencari benar-benar yang murni. Alright, Owen.
Yeah, thanks Brad for a really interesting talk. Saya mau tanya pertanyaan sederhana. Jadi untuk saya tujuan dokumentasi bahasa daerah jelas untuk ya, tapi saya sedikit kurang tahu kalau tujuan dokumentasi multilingualism begini, tujuan untuk apa? Saya tidak tolak cara dokumentasi multilingualism, tapi untuk saya sedikit kurang jelas tujuan untuk apa. Ya begitu saya.
Iya. Jadi maksudnya kurang jelas untuk akademis atau
Untuk orang lokal, tujuan akademis agak jelas, tapi yang untuk orang di desa, ya.
ya, ya betul. Untuk orang di desa, orang lokal, apa ya? Oke. Kalau bahasa sudah masih dipakai ya, biasanya tidak orang-orang di desa tidak terlalu apa ya? Tidak terlalu.
Bisa pakai bahasa Inggris saja.
I know. I'm trying to think. So I'll first try it in English, and then maybe we can try to summarize in Indonesian. But so for the present time, I think that people don't see as much usefulness in the recordings right now. But the way that I've communicated it to people is that it's not necessarily for this moment, but it's for the future, when the language is potentially no longer spoken by children. So this is something that can be passed down or given to future generations.
Yeah, Owen, you happy with that?
Ya.
All right. Anyone in the room? Ada mungkin dari Sumatera yang ingin komen atau from the Zoom? Do we have anyone in the Zoom?
Yes, I believe Antonia has a question.
Ya, Bapak Ibu. Well, you're saying that the approach is multilingual approach, but then in the process, they somehow became resistance. Like maybe you want to say, all right, but we have someone here. Okay, Bu Antonia. And then switch to the unmute, I think.
Excuse me, boleh minta supaya mungkin slideshow dihapuskan? Saya tidak lihat muka siapa-siapa, saya hanya lihat slideshow. Sebentar, badly. I cannot see, saya lihat kecil-kecil saja.
Ready?
Okay, now is good, fine, yes. Okay, terima kasih Brad, mungkin saya pakai bahasa Indonesia dan kalau perlu dijelaskan lagi. Saya setuju sekali dengan double approach dan apa yang dilakukan karena ini yang sebenarnya terjadi di lapangan dan mungkin kita harus meninggalkan idealistic and nostalgic idea bahwa kita hanya mendokumentasi ancestral language. Ini betul-betul terjadi. Saya tahu waktu saya bekerja dengan masyarakat Punan, atas ininya mereka hanya mau saya rekam cerita-cerita rakyat dan pada saat kita transcribe kembali mereka sendiri meminta saya menghapus bagian-bagian yang ada code switching, pemakaian istilah bahasa Indonesia dan lain sebagainya, which I did, maksudnya mereka bersama mereka. Tapi saya percaya juga bahwa kita harus jujur dengan diri sendiri dan dengan situasi di masyarakat. Saya kira bahwa pendekatan dokumentasi bahasa adalah satu pendekatan yang sangat-sangat bagus. Sangat bagus terutama untuk bidang yang sekarang mungkin agak paralel dengan dokumentasi bahasa, yaitu pendekatan antropologi linguistik yang mencoba melihat misalnya konsep of the language and identity in the communities dan lain sebagainya. Pendekatan ini misalnya sedang dipakai saya sedang mengikuti 2 PhD students, exactly what you're doing, di situasi totally different. Jadi misalnya satu mahasiswa di Italia sedang mengikuti praktek bahasa masyarakat Filipina yang tinggal di Italia, cukup besar dan apa yang mereka lakukan. Dan persis ini, dan mahasiswa selalu mengeluh bahwa bahasa Filipina mereka agak sedikit aneh. Of course, of course, karena ada beberapa layers ini. Ini terjadi juga misalnya di Indonesia dengan seorang mahasiswa yang membuat satu pekerjaan cukup bagus tentang praktek bahasa dari masyarakat Indonesia keturunan Hadramaut. Jadi di situ juga kelihatan sekali bahwa tergantung dari situasi mereka memakai bahasa apa untuk tujuan apa. Jadi mungkin kita kalau membuat dokumentasi bahasa mungkin harus mempunyai kita mengumpulkan semua data dan kemudian mungkin dipakai sebagian untuk revitalisasi bahasa sebagaimana Anda sudah tunjukkan dan sebagian lain untuk membuat refleksi lain terhadap situasi kebahasaan yang sebenarnya data-data Anda dan semoga kita semua bisa mengumpulkan data seperti ini bisa berguna untuk membuat berbagai refleksi dan juga untuk masyarakat sendiri. Mungkin dengan memutar mereka sendiri, video misalnya. Bagaimana mereka berbicara dan menunjukkan bagaimana mereka code switch dan bercampur terus-menerus. Mungkin menjadi satu pemicu untuk mereka untuk misalnya berpikir, oh bahasa ancestral kami betul-betul sedang berubah. Jadi saya sebenarnya setuju dan mungkin berguna sekali apa yang dilakukan. Berguna untuk masyarakat dan juga untuk kami sebagai pengamat situasi kebahasaan.
Betul. Betul. Ya, saya setuju. Ya, saya setuju dengan pendapatan Antonia. Jadi kalau bahasa nasal, kalau bahasa nasal tidak ada tidak ada cerita-cerita rakyat, tidak ada cerita-cerita yang lain dan khusus bahasa nasal dulu. Jadi kalau kami mau kalau kami mau mendokumentasikan ancestral code, mungkin tidak mungkin bahasa nasal karena nggak ada yang genre khusus cerita rakyat atau yang lain-lain seperti itu.
Okay, yeah, Bu Antonia, she wants to add.
Yeah, you said, for instance, there's a kind of discrepancy between apa yang direkam dan apa yang dihasilkan, ya? Kira-kira apa? I mean, the products that were produced by the local people, yeah, you were saying. Can you, maybe this is actually tells us what the community wants, which is fine. We help them to do that. But maybe the reality in the field is a bit different, yeah?
Yeah. Jadi, okay. So there's a lot of words that people will use in everyday life that we see all over the corpus that have a nasal pronunciation, that are used clearly in nasal, but they're seen as Malay borrowings. so they don't want to be included in the dictionary.
See?
So that's the sort of discrepancies that we're seeing, is that there's a hyper awareness of what's Nassau and what is not Nassau. So the things that people would gladly include or gladly talk about when speaking to other Nassau people is not included in the dictionary, or actively excluded from the dictionary.
Okay. Yeah, Ibu Antonia.
Yes.
Anyone in Zoom have questions? Mungkin satu dari saya, karena kita masih ada 4 menit juga. Do you find that this your approach encourage semi-speakers? Jadi karena tidak semua, maksud saya tidak semua penutur itu fasih kan, ada yang bisa setengah-setengah, itu sering kita temukan. Apakah pendekatan multilingual ini itu memotivasi mereka yang tidak lancar untuk ikut dalam dokumentasi?
Masih kurang jelas yang semi speaker. Ya, karena ada, kalau yang semi speaker biasanya ya masih agak muda. Masih ada 18, 20 lah. Jadi they're not typically a part of the project too much yet.
Okay, because
So-
of the language being so endangered, so it's kind of hard to.
I think no, it's still, the language is still strong for the adults, for the people who are involved in the documentation. So 30s and 40s, I think most of those people are not the people that were worried about not speaking the language. It's mostly the younger kids who are in their teens and younger that we're seeing the shift.
I see. Yeah, we can accommodate one more. Okay, kalau tidak ada, yeah, we thank you very much, Brad, for this talk. Ya, di sana masih sore ya, di sana di Hawaii. Yeah, I hope you could be there so that we could, hand you a token. But ya, baik, tepuk tangan ya untuk Brad. Terima kasih banyak. Ya, bye, take care.
Baik, terima kasih Ibu Nisa yang sudah memandu diskusi. Terima kasih Pak Bradley yang sudah bersedia memberikan pencerahan kepada kita semua. Tepuk tangan sekali lagi Bapak Ibu untuk beliau. Baik Bapak Ibu, ini masih pukul 9.30 sampai 9.45 kita coffee break terlebih dahulu untuk kemudian menuju sesi panel di lantai 6 seperti biasa hingga pukul 11.45 kita kembali lagi di sini untuk sesi istirahat, kemudian masuk lagi 13.30 untuk pleno terakhir. Terima kasih Bapak Ibu, silahkan istirahat dulu, kemudian nanti masuk ke sesi panel di lantai 6. Ada juga di sini. Terima kasih, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.